Thank you for tuning in to the Practical Preservation Podcast. Please take a moment to visit our website, practicalpreservationservices.com, for additional information and tips to help you restore your historical home. If you've not done so, please subscribe to us on iTunes, Stitcher, or SoundCloud, and also like us on Facebook. Welcome to the Practical Preservation Podcast, hosted by Danielle and Jonathan Kepperling. Kepperling Preservation Services is a family-owned business based in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, dedicated to the preservation of our built architectural history for today's use as well as future generations. Our weekly podcast provides you with expert advice specific to the unique needs of renovating a historic home, educating by sharing our From the Trenches preservation knowledge and our guests' expertise, balancing modern needs while maintaining the historical significance, character, and beauty of your period home.
Today on the Practical Preservation Podcast, we have Lisa Craig with us from the Craig Group. Lisa, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Danielle. Glad to be here.
So tell me a little bit about your background.
Well, I am a 30-plus year practitioner of historic preservation. I actually like to look at it more as community preservation over the years. I've had quite a variety of positions, both volunteer and professional. I've worked pretty much every seat at the table in the historic preservation movement, state preservation officer, local historic preservation, head of a local planning agency, also dealing with property redevelopment on historic sites. Ran a nonprofit historic preservation organization, worked for the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and I'm now doing resilience planning targeted specifically to historic coastal and riverine communities.
And was there something in like the different roles that you have held, were there or positions? Was there something that led you towards the sea, the rising waters, whether it's the sea levels or the river levels?
Yeah. I think in some aspects, yes. I think the first thing we always learn in historic preservation is water is the enemy of any historic building or structure.
It is.
So in some respects, when you get that as a foundation, you pay more attention to how water is impacting building materials and building forms and just the very existence of historic assets. But I think very specifically when I took the position of head of historic preservation for the National Landmark District for City of Annapolis, I was working closely with colleagues at the National Trust for Historic Preservation and the Union of Concerned Scientists, which had just put out their report, Landmarks at Risk. And in that publication, they identified the City of Annapolis and our historic district, based on studies that had been completed by NOAA, that we were experiencing the greatest amount of tidal flooding and sea level rise of any of the coastal communities. It was the largest increase over a 50-year period. And so that being the case, it was pretty evident to us as we were looking at 30 to 40 days of tidal flooding in our historic downtown that we needed to better plan for protection of our historic district.
Yes, yeah. And when we talk a lot about, because in the existing building code, there's exemptions for historic buildings in floodplains because, a lot of times those buildings were built near water because they needed to be near the water, but now that's causing even more problems now that, we have these other the water levels being higher than they ever have been. So
yeah.
How did you start your business? You went from, working for different organizations and municipalities, and then you decided to go out on your own. How did that come about?
Well, I think, as you mentioned previously, and I think it's a good starting point for this. When we look at city codes, particularly floodplain management ordinances, which are now being revised based on the new FEMA maps, we start seeing, interestingly, exemptions or variances for having to adapt historic buildings to a future of rising seas. And I found that odd at a time when we were working so hard in the city of Annapolis to develop a plan for adapting our historic buildings based on FEMA guidance for hazard mitigation planning. And we had done such an effective job of developing the nation's first FEMA-based cultural resource hazard mitigation plan that identified incentives, it identified wet-proofing measures, elevation, relocation of buildings, policies, financial incentives that the city adopted to support the protection and adaptation of those buildings. So I think what I was struck by was investing a good 4 to 5 years of my time and the 32 stakeholders we had time into this project. It was critical for me to spread the word beyond the city of Annapolis. It really became something that many communities were starting to address, many historic coastal communities, and not just because of tidal flooding or extreme precipitation, but because of major disasters. As you know, we can think about the many increased threats of hurricane and extreme precipitation over the last 10 years. There was obviously a need for historic coastal communities to plan for and appropriately adapt buildings. So I had completed my work with the city, as it does happen regularly for those of us working in local government. There was a change in administration. They went one direction and I took another. And so I started working with my colleagues all over the country, and we identified places where I might be able to assist them in planning efforts. So that's what's underway right now. I decided to launch my own firm and use my contacts and use professionals I've been working with over the years to begin a practice around resilience planning for cultural resources and historic communities.
And I think that there's a need for that, because I think that there's an acknowledgement that it's happening and that something needs to be done, but to have somebody that can come in with specialized knowledge and then to bring the stakeholders together, I think is important, because it's kind of charting new territory.
Yes, it is, and it's a very focused area. It's a very specific type of resource base you're working with, and a lot of emotional ties to buildings and historic communities by residents. So it's a fascinating area of resilience planning to be in.
Yes. So can you explain to me, what resilience planning is for specifically for historic preservation, but just in general also?
Right. Well, in the instance of resilience planning, there's a lot of things that in the larger picture of being a more resilient community you plan for. Obviously, issues of disasters and hazards that are shockers to the community. That's typically one of the terms you see. So how communities prepare for, withstand, and recover from those shocks is really resilience planning in a nutshell. But there are other issues. You're dealing with social equity issues, communities who are particularly at threat, not just from disasters, weather-related or otherwise, but also those that may be dealing with the effects of food scarcity or other issues of community need that require a city to plan for the various threats to a community. So it's pretty broad-reaching, but in my particular area, which is really resilience planning for historic communities, we tend to be looking at a little bit of social equity issues, very much so, because we find a lot of communities that have developed over the years, maybe those that are most vulnerable. It could be a historic area, but not all historic buildings were built on high ground. Many, many years ago, hundreds of years ago, you would tend to see many of those buildings built on high ground because they knew the vagaries of Mother Nature, particularly in the southeast, where there's an understanding about hurricanes and extreme storm events. But in other places, that are what we would now say historic, which is really only 50 years or older, you were getting development that was occurring because nobody was paying any attention to where the flood zones were. And they were doing new construction, and all you have to think about is New Orleans to understand, what I'm talking about. So that being the case, resilience planning for historic communities really is focusing on the potential loss of historic assets, those buildings that contribute not only to the architectural and historic character of communities, but also the economic character and needs of those communities. They are heritage assets. It's what draws people to St. Augustine or to Nantucket or to Annapolis or to Charleston. The character of the historic areas is an economic generator for communities. And when a devastating event happens, or when property owners in those communities can't even leave their homes, as is the case in Norfolk when they get high tides, some of those neighborhoods are completely isolated. And so they're not even able to get in and out of their neighborhoods. When that type of event occurs, you need to really be responsible to the future of those residents of those historic properties and those properties themselves, which generate income for the city and for local businesses.
So, do you, when you're working on your plans, do you go in and use? I know you mentioned the FEMA maps, but do you go in and use some of the modeling of the weather events and things, and then figure out how to, or do you look at what the existing conditions are and what's happening now? What are people typically calling you? Is it usually something's happened and now they need, a solution?
Sometimes it is just one more step in an ongoing resilience planning process. Okay. Sometimes it's in response to funding that they received to do some post-event planning, whether it was after Sandy or Irma or Harvey or Matthew or Michael or Florence. We can go on and on.
Right.
The idea is that there is a process that was established by FEMA and frankly is a typical planning process. And it's really 4 steps, and it takes a while to get through those. It took a while for us in Annapolis because there's so many other things going on when you're dealing with a planning office that this is just one program. So what I usually do with any community is first look at what they've already completed. Many times you'll find they have gotten some funding to do what they call a vulnerability assessment, a risk assessment of what really is at risk. And they've looked at their FEMA maps. They know where their flood risk area is, where their 1% chance, or what we call the 100-year, people know it as a 100-year floodplain area is. And so when I come in and we're dealing specifically with a flood risk area that is a historic area, we tend to start by organizing resources, not just understanding what the buildings are and ensuring that a survey has been completed to document all of the buildings that are contributing to the historic character of that community, but to also put together who are the right people that need to be at the table. It's just not the preservationists, it's the planners, it's the emergency managers, it's the environmental staff, it's also the civic organizations, the homeowner groups, the business associations, and most importantly, those property owners that have most at stake. So once you start organizing and understanding your resources at risk, the stakeholders you must have at the table, and then the resources, the funding you need to conduct this work, until you've done that, you really can't move on to the next step, which is the risk assessment, taking those vulnerability studies that have been completed and then determining specifically what buildings are most at risk, and even more importantly, what the community prioritizes as the most important parts of their historic district to protect. Right. That's an exercise we end up going through before we can get to the phase 3 component, which is really the actual planning, setting your goals and objectives, what tasks, what adaptation strategies work best for different building types. And then the fourth step is always making sure you get the money and the collaboration and the agreements in place that may need to be interjurisdictional to provide the resources needed to implement the plan. So it really is a simple 4-step process that can take quite a lot of time to complete.
I can imagine getting everybody, all of the different stakeholders with all the different agendas to agree on priorities. I'm sure that's a challenge.
That's one of the biggest challenges. We spend a lot of time in community engagement and public involvement throughout all 4 steps of the process, because you need that total buy-in.
Yeah, and I know we chatted a little bit before we started the recording, and you talked about one of the challenges you're struggling with right now too is community engagement. In the era of social distancing. So I don't know. Do you have any workarounds that you've devised? Or are you still working on some solutions for that?
Well, I think one of the good signs is now that historic district commissions or historic preservation commissions, which work under local government agencies, usually within the planning area, are now starting to do online meetings. They're using typically Zoom, a combination of Zoom and YouTube is something they're using in Nantucket, in order to engage community members through kind of an abbreviated public process, but importantly a public process no less, in going through their normal agenda. So we're looking at opportunities in different communities to do just that. In some respects, we're probably meeting as stakeholder team members more frequently via Zoom. So we are doing that on a consistent basis with those that are part of the planning team. But I think we're now just starting to look at other mechanisms, more than just conducting webinars. This is certainly a tool that's been around for a long time. But instead being more interactive by looking at other means. We're looking at 2 approaches. We're looking at a podcast-based approach to basically after a webinar or as part of a Zoom meeting, do follow-on interviews with community members who express an interest in talking more about the topic and getting their feedback on the information that was presented. So it's not just a Q&A, which we can still easily do through Zoom, but it goes beyond. It takes it into what are your thoughts behind this? How does climate change, sea level rise impact you and your business, your livelihood, or you and your family and your property? So we'll be using a podcast format if we can make that work through America Adapts, which is hosted by Doug Parsons. And that's something we're looking at. And then we're also looking at another a platform of online video broadcasting, where we can do a conference, in essence, via an online interview process with panelists, where the community can ask questions and engage with the audience online. So we're looking at a variety of different formats to be able to conduct these workshops, because the community engagement aspect is so important. We can do online surveys, which we've done in the past successfully in communities. I've worked with like St. Augustine and Nantucket. And I think we'll be able to still get, and maybe even more so, inclusivity in our surveys, because we're reaching out to a broader group of individuals. Many times if you go to a conference and you schedule the conference or the workshop during the middle of the day, people don't come. They're working, and so you may get a lot more retirees and others who can take time from their workday to attend.
Right.
If you do it on a weekend, you may not get public employees coming to it because they want to be home with their families. So we're hoping that by doing a combination of webinars, podcasts, online broadcasting videos, YouTube, we can reach a more diverse audience.
Yeah, I would think that that makes it more accessible and more. I guess accessible is the word I was thinking, but it does make it so that there's a less of a barrier to entry.
Right, exactly. And even to the point, we had a follow-on conversation today about it may be a very effective educational tool. Something like a podcast, snippets like that could be played, with parents and children. There's everyone staying home now. So as a parent, maybe you're using this as a tool to educate your children. And so it really has no age barrier, and I think that's what we're trying to do is get it down to the future generations that actually will have to deal with this problem in a very urgent way if we don't do anything now. So it's a wonderful time in some respects to be working remotely and really thinking about how technology is so vital to our continued connection with people and with topics we hold dear.
Yeah, I agree. So I know that you look at the entire community. What are the typical solutions that you come up with? Is it raising the buildings? Is it moving the buildings? Is it creating barriers? Like is there a typical solution, or is every community different?
No, it's like people in some respects. There's different treatment methods for any type of disease. So I think that we're looking at situations where, depending on the current condition of the building, where it's located, the type of community that it's in. It may be easier in Louisiana to raise a single-family home, to elevate it on piers, than it would be to do a row house in Annapolis. I mean, the building is a different form, structure, material makeup. And so what we look at instead is adaptation alternatives beyond elevation. Elevation does work in some instances, and it can be attractively and sensitively designed, particularly in a single family situation.
That makes sense.
But when you don't have that, when you're in a setting much like Charleston, where you have row houses or you have single family homes immediately adjacent to each other, and you have an entire block of what in Charleston they'll refer to as sister houses, where they look exactly the same all the way up the street, and then one person decides to elevate it. What is the precedent you're setting? Because at some point in time, it's possible the rest of the street will have to do it, but think very carefully about how the commission approves that first prototype, because everything else will follow. So when you're looking at that, compared to when you're looking at small frame cottages in Nantucket, shingle-sided buildings that need to be elevated, or in some instances maybe even relocated from their position back if there's available land. Some of the finest homes in Sconset on the island of Nantucket aren't experiencing sea level rise in terms of rising waters. They're experiencing erosion of the land on which, the cliffs on which they're constructed. So they relocate and they have to move back It's one thing if you have multi-million-dollar homes and you can afford to do that. It's another thing if you're a small cottage that your family has had for years, and you don't know if you can afford that.
Yeah,
so,
we were in Oregon last year for Christmas. My dad's family's from Oregon, and we were on the coast. And the amount of erosion just in my recallable lifetime was, there's, now it's like a 4-foot drop, from where you would walk over the dune to go to the beach. It's not just a slope anymore. It's like a
drop. Yeah. And I think that's why it's so important not only to think about the adaptation as it relates to typical understanding of building elevation, but also are there other things you can do to flood-proof your building? And do you do things that are temporary for purposes of anticipating a major storm event, wrap the lower half of your building versus maybe something more permanent, like looking at a combination of things. If you're on the coast, can you first construct a living shoreline and then ramp up and do a small barrier wall to retaining wall, and then ramp up again and create somewhat of a dune or another natural resource base before you get to the house. So I think really we're trying to look sensitively to how we can use nature-based solutions equal to structural solutions, and some things may just be, let's do a better design for a window or door dam, so we're not using sandbags, but instead we're using something with a stronger structural ability to maintain water away from the material itself. Or in some instances, do we wet or dry flood-proof in the sense that we want to keep the water out? And with the barrier, we want to allow the water to wash in, through, and out again so that we have flood vents underneath buildings so the water can wash in and then out. Or even in commercial buildings near the water, concrete floors, we open up and let the water rush in and out. We elevate mechanicals so that they're out of the way. So I think property owners have to be creative and thoughtful on the strategy that will best protect their resource and allow them to afford after an event to be able to rebuild or
and
restore.
I'm thinking too that's maybe working more with the nature instead of trying to fight it. Like allowing let the flood happen. It's going to happen, and then make it easy to recover from that rather than having to do some of the the complete rebuilds of
exactly.
the first floor.
Yeah. That's the case.
So are your clients mostly then municipalities?
Mostly. I tend to work for local governments because those are the ones that are doing the planning efforts, but I have worked for historic nonprofits. So, for example, Historic Annapolis is a nonprofit organization that serves as the steward for 12 state-owned buildings, but they are a separate 501c3. They realized that they needed to develop a disaster and emergency management plan for their buildings. And, as in all buildings, they deal older buildings. There's always a great concern for fire. Unfortunately, a terrorism activity, if you're in a state capital, they have to think about that. But the other thing they have to consider are other natural disasters if they're dealing with extreme storm events, for example. So we worked with a small management team, which included their curator of collections, because with historic property, sometimes not just the building, it's the valuable resources inside. So we worked to develop a plan whereby they could strategically phase in improvements to the buildings that would better adapt them to their current flood risk. and identified what needs to be done in the case of an emergency. If they know there is going to be a flooding event happening, a major storm coming, how do they secure their collections, and doing it in a strategic way so it's the best use of their time and effort. So that's one other organization I've worked with, and I hope to be able to do more of those plans, a very effective online process for disaster planning for historic sites. And then I've worked with some of the national organizations. I'm working right now with the National Alliance of Preservation Commissions to develop disaster training modules for communities, for historic preservation commissions, so they can understand better how to incorporate into their ordinances, into their design review standards, treatment of historic buildings for flooding adaptation. So those are, I get to often work with private nonprofit groups as well.
That seems having the training aspect, I think, too, allows you to impact more areas and more properties. So that, I think, that's a good.
Yeah.
It also
and
is
it's
a
kind
good
of
way to introduce yourself.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And train the trainer, I think, is the concept. Is the more I get out to those who are in decision making positions, the more confidence I have that they're sharing the lessons they've learned with their community members.
Yes. Yeah. So I think we talked a little bit about what a homeowner can do, whether, depending on the type of house they're in, the structure and things like that. But do you have any specific tips for a homeowner?
The first thing I always tell everybody, this is just, I don't know if this is, from my own personal experience or just from working with FEMA so closely, is buy flood insurance. It doesn't matter if you think, well, I'm not in the flood zone, or if your bank doesn't require you to because they don't see you in the flood zone, or if you don't have a mortgage and you're not required to get flood insurance, you don't need to buy flood insurance, because at some point in time, somebody will have a flood in their property. If it crosses your property line and gets into yours, you're covered by the National Flood Insurance Program. So, or if there's a water main break in the city, that's the other thing I see failing right now, is infrastructure is in such bad shape. We tend to see when we get these flooding events, flooding is occurring all over. Once it crosses a property line and goes onto your property line, you are covered under the National Flood Insurance Program. So the first thing I say to people is get flood insurance. Then the second thing I do is just give them information about where their property sits within the flood zone. Help them understand what the chances are of a flood event. And when you try to explain to people and use the term 100-year flood event, that they think means, oh, there's one chance in 100 years, when in reality it's one chance every year that you'll be flooded the next year. And so it really becomes a situation where you might experience 26 floods over 100 years. You don't know. It's just a situation that you need to anticipate. And I don't like to point it out, but I have to point it out. One of my nearest and dearest places that I would go to, Ellicott City, Maryland,
they've had
They have within an 18-month period, and you had the governor first saying, oh, but it was a 1 in 1,000 year event, and then it happened again just over a year later. So I think it's really important that we not use those terms in an irresponsible way, and we explain flood risk is constant. So after educating individuals, after advising them on how to best protect their assets, after explaining have a family emergency plan first, that's the most important thing, because you can't deal with your own property unless you've made sure your family is safe and secure. Right. So usually that's when we start getting into the alternatives for adaptation for their own personal properties, and trying to explain to them the benefits, the financial benefits of investing that money now. versus what your potential costs could be in the instance of a loss is another focus I try to take.
But that's a really good way to look at it. Rather than viewing it as an expense now, it's more of it's more of a almost buying insurance.
It's a savings. I know that there in terms of the costs related to planning, or the savings related to planning for disaster events, FEMA has, using some studies that have been done nationally, FEMA has stated, and it's pretty clear, that the savings that a community realizes by investing $1 now means $6 in savings in the instance of disaster recovery later. So they're really focusing on providing funding to local governments to help plan and prepare for future events, just because of the fact that the more prepared you are, the less damage you're likely to have in your communities. So it is certainly an economic benefit to plan for loss, but at the same time do the best that you can to minimize that loss.
Right. Yeah, definitely. So is there anything that you wish that you knew when you got started, either in your career or your business? You can take it however you want, that you know now.
that I know now. I tell people sometimes, and I love the work that our historic preservation offices at the state and the local community does when it comes to surveying historic buildings. I think it's really important for us to understand how those particular properties, buildings, landmarks have evolved, what they've meant to our community, the people and the patterns of public history that are tied intimately to particular buildings and places. And some very evocative stories we learned through that process. But the one thing I will say is that when I first started, I really didn't fully embrace how important local government ordinances and policies are to the preservation or the demolition and loss or destruction of our historic assets. So I think the thing I do a lot now is policy. I mean, to me, it's really important to identify communities that have incentives, that have good policies in place that balance historic preservation with community development, economic development, and other community needs. And so I think the thing I've learned the most is it's not just about focusing on the values of historic preservation. You sometimes have to take your preservation hat off and sit at the table with the emergency manager and really understand that what they're trying to do, what they're trying to achieve in the protection of people and places has some resonance with what you're trying to do as well.
Right.
So just empathize. Particularly if you've been through disasters, you're kind of in it together with those other agency heads, and learn a lot more about some of the other fields in which you work in local government, because I think that if I had had a stronger understanding that policy is really about people first, and places and people, kind of naturally fit together.
Right.
It would have been a much easier thing for me to do. So I've learned that over the years. I think we all learned something
I
that
agree.
through our
I
profession.
agree. And I know when I do, when we do presentations and we're talking about the different, they're mostly for homeowners, and we're talking about, the different regulations and things for historic buildings. And I'll say, all of this is decided on the local level. So if your municipality does not have a demolition review process or anything like that, you need to get involved with your municipality, because that's
right.
the only way you're going to stop it. Chaining yourself to the bulldozer. it's not the way you're going to stop it.
It's still there every once in a while, but a little bit more a thing of the past. And
right.
I think we've benefited from having a strong historic preservation program, but it does seem to be constantly under threat. I think educating at the local level, one of the things I learned with this work in resilience planning is that you must have key decision makers at the table when you're developing these plans. If you can't get your city manager, your council member, your director of the planning department, your head of the tourism agency, if you can't get all of those people, your chamber head or Main Street head, if they're not in the room when you're coming up with your goals and objectives and coming up with strategies, then you've missed the boat.
Right.
You really will not be able to get their buy-in at the end if they weren't part of the crafting of your plan at the beginning. So I think that's probably the second thing I've learned most. Oh, and that's probably why I named my firm the way I did, because it's really about partners and planning and policy. You got to have all three of those effectively working together before you can have a successful historic preservation program.
I agree. So do you see a lot of different communities. What do you see as the biggest challenges or trends in preservation?
Well, it's interesting. Here's my perception, having started my preservation career. I started my preservation career in Savannah, and it was really going to school at Savannah College of Art and Design, and then relocating back to the West Coast, and going to the University of Oregon and running the nonprofit, the Historic Preservation League there. So the East Coast, West Coast, okay. East Coast has a much stronger, and I really didn't think of this seriously until I spent my last 30-some years there. East Coast has a much stronger preservation ethic. There is a concern for property rights, quote unquote, and the imposition of preservation rules on top of planning rules and so forth in communities in the East. But they don't really take it. They have a stronger regard for their history, I believe, and I think it's just because it's older, and then they're dealing with hundreds of years worth of historic architecture and community development and planning. So it was easier to do preservation, not that we didn't have property rights issues that we were dealing with, but it was more building by building. Having come back and living in a fairly conservative small town in California, which is itself, a very forward-looking state, I've been surprised to see that my community doesn't have a historic preservation ordinance. It has a nice historic character to its downtown. It has historic neighborhoods that are still intact with no real designation. And so, buildings now are starting to be demolished. Right. And it's been interesting to see the loss of a number of historic school buildings. I was dealing with school building restoration issues and demolition 20 years ago. I thought we were past that, but clearly not. And I think that what I have come to appreciate is that it's cyclical. You're constantly coming back around to what were topical issues 20 years ago are topical again. Mm-hmm. So constant education and awareness building of the value of historic buildings as community assets and what their economic opportunities are, why you should save them, how sustainability plays a key role in that, and how heritage tourism is impacted when certain buildings are gone. So I think that's really what I've come to appreciate and why in some respects I'm probably out in front on this concept of resilience planning, just because I think we need to keep looking forward and, be on top of our game when it comes to what is the next biggest threat for historic assets. And in this particular instance, I really think it's Mother Nature. So.
Yeah, I agree with you. So how should our listeners contact you?
They can contact me via my email, which is lcraiggroup@gmail.com. They can check out my website at thecraiggroup.partners.com. And they can, find me on LinkedIn. I get so many people from LinkedIn. I can't believe it. So it's always a great tool through LinkedIn to connect with me and see if I can help you with your preservation issue.
Okay, very good. And I forgot to ask you, I usually ask before I ask how people should contact you. Is there anything that I didn't ask you or that we didn't cover that you wanted to mention?
I think the only thing I really ever want to stress is the importance of, in the preservation community, in any profession, obviously, but certainly in the preservation community, I'm a big supporter of mentoring. And so I've found over the years that working with students, working with interns, using interns to help with research, and kind of giving them a certain amount of free rein to do their projects has been very effective for our community. I've been very blessed to have some excellent interns over the years who have gone off to do really good work with preservation organizations. So oftentimes I'll unfortunately hear from colleagues, oh, I don't want to work with an intern. It takes too much time. I have to train them. They have to learn this. And what I would say to that is that I think we are all responsible for the next generation in our field, and it just isn't what happens in the classroom. It's also what happens in the field. So I can't stress enough to those people out there that have the ability to bring a young student in to work with them. I've worked with high school students all the way up to older students who have gone back to school as interns. So I would encourage the preservation community and those listening to really find themselves an intern and work to shape that person's future.
Yeah, I think whenever we have an intern, and we've had multiple in the field and in the office, and I always try to give experiences that they might not get otherwise, and
exactly.
Because that's just, I mean, that's what I enjoy learning all the time. So I just assume everybody's like me.
Well, then that's a good assumption to make. I think we should go with that. So we're always learning. Hey, I started learning about resilience and doing this work when I was in my 50s. So, it's really important to understand you're always going to learn, and you've got to learn new things to be relevant in your field.
Yeah, I agree. So do you have, I know that the world is kind of crazy right now, but do you have any seminars or publications or anything that you want to let our listeners know about?
I don't have any right now that are coming out. I certainly would like to, though, encourage people, and I just say this because it's been so useful to me, is to stay tuned to a couple of the organizations and podcasts and webinars. I already mentioned Doug Parsons with America Adapts. I think that's a great resource. I'm constantly finding connections to heritage and preservation through those broadcasts, as well as best practice examples. I'd also say stay tuned to the Main Street America webinars. They're doing some great webinars that are talking about how businesses can survive and then thrive through this period, this downturn and the social distancing, and how we can build on small business and economic recovery. So I'm a big supporter of local and small business because those people keep those buildings that we love dearly occupied.
Right.
So those are two I'm really focusing on right now as great learning resources.
Okay, well, thank you very much for coming on today.
Thanks for listening to the Practical Preservation Podcast. The resources discussed during this episode are on our website at practicalpreservationservices.com/podcast. If you received value from this episode and know someone else that will get value from it as well, please share it with them. Join us next week for another episode of the Practical Preservation Podcast. For more information on restoring your historic home, visit practicalpreservationservices.com.